is a podcast made by women for women. We talk with a wide variety of experts, ranging from a sex therapist to the CDC and everywhere in between, to bring you the stories you're only going to hear here. Our goal is to entertain and educate, because it's more clear now than ever just how much we as women are doing, as parents, as spouses, employees, just as everything. Don't miss out on being in the know. Subscribe to Soul Source wherever you listen to podcasts today. Leave us a review too, because this part's really important. When you leave those reviews, that's how we're able to continue bringing you the content you love each and every week. So buckle up, Soul Source Society, because we're about to get started.
Inequities exist as long as humans exist. So it's okay to be frustrated, it's okay to be tired, but the problem is when people think there's going to be a quick fix. And the problem is when people think they're going to just be happy and feel fulfilled.
Hello, everybody. I am your host, Raquel Amel, here on Soul Source. And this episode today is going to be talking about something pretty important. And I feel like we've seen a very recent shift in years here in the US, especially. People are becoming a little more and more aware of the racial injustices that we have here in this country, but we have a long way to go yet. And it's encouraging to see people starting to at least acknowledge this and try to take some steps toward trying to correct this in some ways. I myself, I know at Red Shoes specifically, we've been doing some cultural competency training. We've been trying to become more aware of some of the racial injustices happening and taking steps ourselves within our company to try and actually eliminate some of the barriers that are set there. And it's kind of crazy. I mean, just think about the holidays, right? Your holidays on your calendar and your days off from work are very white focused holidays. So it's very interesting how the system is set up. And once you start diving into it, the changes that are being made. Today, my guest is Kimya Nuru Dennis. She's a community advocate, a sociologist, criminologist, educator, and researcher with a company called 365 Diversity. She's here to talk with me about the ways society in the US and everything I just talked about here, especially in the professional world, just is not set up for people of color and how we can help to change that. So Kimya, welcome to Soul Source.
Thank you so much. I am happy to be here.
I am really glad we're having this conversation. It's an important one. Now, I kind of mentioned that all your titles are, you have a lot of them, and that you work with all sorts of businesses and organizations on results-based training workshops, evaluations, and assessments in regards to diversity. Tell me a little bit more, though. What is 365 Diversity? Because it's not the typical diversity training, is it?
No. So I am a Black woman. I also have a disability. I'm born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, which is second capital of the Confederacy. And I was in North Carolina for 17 years. That's where I got my doctorate, and I was also full-time faculty. And now I live in Baltimore. And so I always explain this background because my work is based in centuries of Black work before the term anti-racism existed. We have centuries of Black teachers, researchers, scholars, activists, community activists, as well as Indigenous people who have done this racial equity, racial justice work. And also Black people have done racial justice trainings, particularly for white people, since the 1960s, before people got paid for this stuff. So that's why I'm not your typical diversity training, because most people only know New York Times bestseller books. They only know those anti-racism trainings, bias trainings, which I don't believe in bias trainings. I don't support those. They know the new stuff from the past 10 years. And it's extremely racist and anti-Black and anti-Indigenous to not know the historical core of this work that existed before our people's writings were considered credible enough to be a New York Times bestseller. Right? So, most of our books are not included in libraries, but not included in curriculum. So being a New York Times bestseller is actually a warning that it's not really the foundation of what Black people and Indigenous people have done for centuries.
It's just more of how that system is built up.
Yes, it's compliance. Yes, whenever you're a bestseller, that's because you're challenging enough, but you're complying enough. And particularly when looking at white liberals, white progressives, you're challenging enough, but it's still in line with what white liberals, white progressives want at any given moment. And you're using the wording and terminology that's comforting enough. And the same thing I always tell people I don't do typical diversity trainings because I'm actually changing curriculum, changing policies, changing assessments, changing evaluations. If we're talking about removing police, we're talking about specific shifts in the funds and resources that Black people have actually written and explained for more than a century for police departments, medical and health facilities, and schools. So the work I do, I tell people, when you hire me, we're not going to spend time defining terminology. We're not going to define racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, because that's usually an intentional distraction to actually make changes. You can literally, we're adults, right? But people conveniently act like they're K through 12 because they want to disguise from changes. They want you to waste 2 hours debating, is there such thing as racism against white people? There's not, but they will waste your time trying to debate that. They'll say, is there such thing as sexism against men? There's not, but they'll waste your time trying to debate that. Is there such thing as cisgender people being oppressed? Is there such thing as heterosexuals being oppressed? There's not, but they will try to waste your time for 2 hours. And at the end of it, they all go to lunch, have a good fun time because nothing was done beyond discussing, debating. And so I'm a sociologist, criminologist, and before I founded 365 Diversity, I was doing this work. I was on board of directors, and it was the same problem over and over again. And so that's why I just started making changes.
You're shaking the system up a little bit, but that's got to come as a shock to some people, I would think, when you come in. Or do people know what they're getting when you come?
Most people know what they're getting if they've actually paid attention to not just my work, but centuries of Black work and Indigenous work. Mm-hmm. They know. However, people who have gone based on New York Times bestseller books and gone based on what they've seen on social media and any given hot topic on a news show on any given moment, they think that equity and justice are based on what's trending at any given moment. They're not accustomed to changes. They're accustomed to official statements. They're accustomed to, for like school officials, school teachers, they do a professional development session, they check it off their lists, everyone moves on. And they're accustomed to people complaining to HR and pretending HR actually is based on the purpose of the employees rather than the legal purpose of the employer. So unfortunately, most adults do what they critique children for doing. A lot of times they say children are short-sighted and don't understand the goals and purpose and how what they're doing can harm the goals and purpose. Unfortunately, adults perpetuate that because humans are hundreds of thousands of years of inequities and injustices. It just varies by identity because some identities did not exist until 5 centuries ago. For example, race was invented 5 centuries ago for the purpose of capitalism, colonialism, this slave trade, and so forth. So, yeah.
So walk me through a little bit. I know you kind of touched on how you're a little different, but could you tell me a little bit more about, like, if someone's calling you in, what does it look like? What are we doing if we're doing a training?
Yep. So one thing I always ask is for their demographic data in terms of their employees and also who they are reaching, whether it's a nonprofit base, whether it's a school, or whether it is a business for profit. Who are you reaching? And a lot of places, most places will say they don't know the demographic data, which is false. Every entity knows their demographic data. We have GIS coding data that's used by chambers of commerce. It's used by marketing teams to know which zip codes are more likely to be their consumers. They know which zip codes are reached for schools, right? Mm-hmm. They know where families tend to be located, where the children at the school live. So whenever people say they don't have demographic data, that's false. Instead, they only have the kind of demographic data that they think will not label them as racist. But we have to remember that race is always correlated with gender. Race is always correlated with socioeconomic status, which includes education, occupation, and income. All of that is correlated. So if anyone uses zip code data or area code data to determine their customer, and that's how they get their email listservs and their mailing lists, then they also know the particular racial and ethnic groups, the socioeconomic statuses, the language, immigration status, Oftentimes they'll have access to religions and spiritualities, able health, disability. They have access to all of that. It's just a matter of which parts they want to throw away because they don't think it matters for consumers or patients for medical and health services. And they also think that they can pretend to be race neutral or class neutral. And there's no such thing as neutrality regarding our identities and our experiences.
Why is that?
Because there shouldn't be. Like, I'm a Black woman,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't silence at any time. Where, as a professor, when I work in nonprofits, when I do presentations and trainings, never will I pretend to be a robot. And I tell the same thing to white people regarding race, because despite the fact that white people are the ones who presented racial categorizations for profit, white people are this false racial neutrality. And that's the core of what sociologists term colorblind racism, where white people in particular say, well, this has nothing to do with race. Having something to do with race means that things always vary by race. It does not equate to racism. So like, racial identity is not synonymous with racism. And I always explain this to people. Mm-hmm. Being Black does not mean that my identity is synonymous with oppression. It's not synonymous with enslavement. It's not synonymous with Jim Crow. We've existed for thousands of years in various cultures and identities around the world. So it's not synonymous with racism. So when people do not want to talk about racial variance, they're afraid of it being about racism and about white power. Mm-hmm. And so that's problematic as well, because when people are afraid of being labeled or blamed for something, that's actually telling more on them than it is on anyone else. If they're so paranoid that they want to hide what's really happening, when they hire people to do equity work, including if they have a DEI office, they can hire people, but they really want the people to not say anything that's groundbreaking, because they really want things to stay as they are, everyone to be nice. And niceness happens even when there are inequities within the institution. There could be a payroll problem. There could be a benefits problem. There could be customers complaining all the time. There could be employees complaining. But the idea is at the surface level, let's make everything smooth and everything looks okay.
Gotta be frustrating in your line of work to have that happening when you're doing what you're doing.
Well, it's not really frustrating because, again, humans are the same. Like, humans have, this is one thing as sociologists and criminologists, we talk about trends and patterns. So there's nothing said and done that's shocking. And when we talk, the same thing, we talk about gender, right? When men do not want to admit that there are gender inequities and they pretend that payroll is based on just being more skilled, they get offended, not because of facts, but because they're not accustomed to facts resulting in a change and an outcome, and people giving them ultimatums that if you don't make this change, we're going to go elsewhere as customers, consumers, and patients and students even. And so things that people do, it's typical. That's why I always tell people, every new technology is going to be used by the same power majority. So there's nothing that's different about what people say, including like when white people create anonymous accounts to send me emails and stuff. It's the same insults. It's the same thing of calling you ugly, calling you stupid, trying to mock anything that might be happening in your life. It's literally the same thing for 5 centuries. And so that's why I always tell people, don't be distracted by what people try to say and do to insult you. It's just like we tell girls, women, and cisgender girls and women, if boys and men contact you to call you ugly, to say you hate boys, you hate men, that's the same, literally the same rhetoric for generations, right? Mm-hmm. It's never new. It's never creative. It's never designed to be profound. Instead, it's designed to say the same thing over and over again, that just find different technology methods to do it. And then the purpose is to distract you. It's to make you feel negative emotions. It's to make you feel like, oh my goodness, everyone hates me. My work means nothing. So the same way we tell people to keep doing the work, balance your personal life with your professional life, but to keep doing the work regarding gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, the same thing pertains to when we're addressing race. When people try to insult Black people for doing this work, I always tell people, Black people have done this work for centuries, literally it's not a new thing just because people are just noticing it.
So let's talk about implicit bias, because I know that's a term that's been thrown out a lot recently, especially since George Floyd. And I know that that's something that you don't necessarily align with, right?
Nope. So bias always exists. Prejudices always exist. In sociology, we talk about it. So in sociology and criminology, we use Dr. Robert K. Merton. So when I do presentations and trainings, and when I teach race and ethnic relations courses for college students, I use Robert K. Merton's typology of prejudice and discrimination, where Robert K. Merton generations ago explained what people have explained for centuries. You can have prejudices, but that doesn't mean you're going to have the actions that go with it. And that can impact whether you have the power, the decision-making ability, or the list goes on. So that's why I always distinguish prejudice from discrimination. And I always say there are people who have discriminatory policies and practices, but they go home and their wife is Mexican. They just won't hire Mexicans at the business. So what they'll do is they'll rationalize it and they'll say, well, my customers do not want people who at least appear to be unlawful immigrants. My customers do not want people who at least seem to speak Spanish as their original language. However, I love my wife and children. So that's where prejudice and discrimination can go together, but they're not required. So I consider implicit bias trainings, and including assessments that people now do with surveys where they answer questions. I consider those a waste of time and money, because after you do these, then what? People are going to always be defensive from their biases. If they admit they have bias, okay, now what? I tell people all the time, even when I teach college students since 2004, I can't change how people are thinking, what they're believing. Instead, there's a reason why we have policies, practices, we do annual assessments. There's a reason why we have laws. And I always tell people, don't celebrate politicians signing legislation. You have to see, is it actually being enacted, right? Difference between signing it and actually it's happening, right? So it's a huge difference, including when we talk about hate crime laws. So I don't believe in implicit bias trainings. I don't attend trainings. I haven't done that for years. People actually appreciate my not attending because I'm actually going to ask questions and challenge people. Because implicit bias trainings are the same thing as the original diversity trainings, where people would share slices of cake and say, whoever has the biggest cake, you're the most privileged. Like, we're not in preschool, right? So I feel the same way about implicit bias trainings. It does not matter how people rationalize it. It does not matter what people claim they've gotten from it. I also have problems with when people get Ivy League schools to do like these bias tests, whether it's created at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, none of that matters, because now you're going based on this European white standard and you've taken a test, now what? And most people cannot explain the now what. They'll say things like, well, now I see my true self. I'm now going to hold myself accountable. I'm going to read some books. That means absolutely nothing. It means nothing when cisgender heterosexual people say that to LGBTQIA people. It means nothing when men say that to transgender and cisgender women. It means nothing when white people and white enough people say that to Black people, Indigenous people, Asian people, non-white Hispanic people, non-white Latinx, Latin A, Latin O people. We don't care about the tests you're taking anymore. We don't care about your book clubs and your hashtags and stuff anymore. That's nothing but feeling that you're polite. Now what's changing? And I take that back. Some people care, but those of us who actually really want changes to contribute to lifetimes, every generation after us, don't care. Mm-hmm.
It makes sense. I understand that, because it's important, yes, to understand and to know, like, okay, you're wired this way and this is how you think, but it's, what are you going to do about it, right? So what do you want? What needs to happen? What would be the right way to go about creating the change that we want to see? I know that's a loaded question.
Well, it is. So people actually know what to do. I promise you, people actually know what to do. It's just a matter of what topic they consider interesting at any given moment. And it's about what they can they feel empowered to do in any given moment. So for example, teachers expressing outrage during COVID-19. Some teachers are leaving and going to another school or leaving teaching altogether during COVID-19. I ask these teachers, what have you ignored or downplayed throughout your career? Like the lack of disability services at your school. You don't have ramps at your school. So people with physical conditions and some mental conditions have to take the stairs. There's no elevator. You ignored that. You still went to work, you smiled, right? Bathroom access. Oh, wow, it's gender specific. That sucks. But you ignored that. You went to work and you said, I have to pay bills. Ooh, racism in the school books, because this textbook is not a correct depiction of American history, world history. The foundation of indigenous people existed before Christopher Columbus and the Pilgrims showed up. Black people, we're people before enslavement. Asians happened before the Japanese were camped and murdered, right?
Yeah.
We have hundreds of thousands of years of histories, arts, literature, sciences, mathematics, knowledges around the world, but it's not in schools, including in PhD programs and medical degree programs. But yet teachers still show up to work. But COVID is the deal breaker. So this is why I always tell people, and when people celebrate their teachers' unions, most places do not have teachers' unions, but people who do, they tend to demand salary increase. It is extremely rare in every school district for a teacher union to focus on curriculum changes, changing accreditation, changing the school tests, changing the library. That's extremely rare. It's mostly based on salary. Teachers are fine with that. So when COVID is a deal breaker, that's where I say, I'm not going to applaud you. I'm going to say, whose lives were risked?
That's
for your
what
salary
I was
before?
gonna say was it's always, I mean, I feel like when people are protesting something or going up against the system, it's because it impacts them personally, right?
And there's some other things that impact people personally, but when you have primary minoritized identity, primary meaning these are more in your face identities that are more obvious to people. Most minoritized people, like Black people, for example, are told throughout our life that we can't fight against everything. There are a lot of things we have to ignore in order to exist in peace in schools. We would never graduate through schools, including PhD programs in sociology, if you fought against every misrepresentation in books and journal articles. So a lot of people are told throughout their lives that you have to have goals beyond just fighting against every problem. And then we're also told that once you finish this process, you can really fight against the problems after you finish this process. So you're basically complying so that you can get through this employment process, this academic process, and then you're going to have the real ability to make changes. The real ability to make changes is always relative because once you reinforce the problems, now you're partly to blame for the problems, right? So that's another thing. So this is what I always tell people. Most people know how to make changes. They don't do it because they know it's uncomfortable. They know it's going to mess up their job. They know it's going to mess up their curriculum while they're in school. It's going to mess up their friends and family routine. So they know. And the example I always use is white people who are outraged at mostly white people during January 6, 2021. A lot of white people were like, I'm outraged. And I'm like, are we saying that you all did not know anyone who was there? Like a lot of white people said, I'm ending all of my friendships and family ties with people who voted for Trump. That was cool on social media in 2016 and 2020, but I don't believe that 99% of white people followed through on that. Because when the attention and the fame disappears from hashtags and social media jargon, in people's real life, they know that their families are not easy to cut off like that. They know their employers. People will tell you there's a lot of things that they tolerate when they're at work, when they're at school. They might not say things in classroom, but they're things that they hear people talk about in the office space. And they can't complain about everything, or else eventually they will be considered Debbie Downer, and people find a way to punish them or get rid of them altogether. So I always tell people they know what to do. It's now a problem of people not forming alliances and collaborations to make changes. Most people, unfortunately, think that they can make a change by themselves. They know how to form book clubs, but they don't know how to form change-making clubs. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like when I do presentations for school officials and teachers, sometimes they'll say, Dr. Dennis, but what do we do? I said, have you never contacted the school down the street? Like, you all belong to teachers' organizations and you attend these conferences. What are y'all talking about? Like, really, what are y'all talking about if you're not talking about problems, the way you all can help each other locally, nationally, and around the world where teachers are having the same problems? You all are talking about this darn book club, talking about this darn book that you adopted in your classroom, but you're cool with having lunch with the teacher next door to you whose books are horrible. Why are you bragging about your book and you're having lunch with a teacher whose curriculum is horrible and they're not required by accreditation and school officials? So I tell people this is where people just have to admit they're apathetic, empathetic, don't care, or they're afraid of breaking their ties to their friends and colleagues. And that's where the honesty is required for real changes. Because I can help places make changes. I can rewrite. That's what we do. I help them rewrite their guides and all sorts of stuff. But when I'm here to do the 6-month follow-up and they don't respond to me, that's because they'll say they got busy, but it's usually because things just weren't as quick and easy as they had pretended, but I already told them it wasn't quick and easy.
You have a very no bullshit approach. It's just very like, and I love it. I love that you're being just so open and honest. Like, if you want to see change, you'll see it and you'll do something about it. Because I do feel like there's a lot that is very glossed over. It's very like, oh, well, we're going to do this. And like you said, the social media pretty, and that's not real.
Yeah. And that's what I always say, all humans for hundreds of thousands of years are guilty for having some kind of power based on demographic, cultural identity, and not making the changes that people promise conceptually and theoretically. That's hundreds of thousands of years around the world. So that's not a new concept. It's not just an American concept. But I always tell people that we have to be honest that we're not doing what we should do, instead of pretending the problem is the trainer. Oh, that trainer didn't give us what we needed. Yes, the trainer did. You just did what your students do that you criticize. They take notes and don't read it. Don't do anything with it, right? And so this is why I just tell people to be honest. So I'm cisgender heterosexual. When I do work, particularly with Black LGBTQIA, I go into spaces, I'm not welcomed, I'm not thanked, nor should I be, because I am the power majority. This is stolen and abused power. Nobody has to say, thank you for being here, and to put the attention on me. This is also why I don't believe in a such thing as ally. I don't believe in a such thing as white ally, cisgender ally, heterosexual ally. I don't believe in a such thing as wealthy ally for poor people. Because when you give people a title, you're putting the focus on celebrating them instead of telling them, we're not impressed, challenge yourself, be consistent, and acknowledge your lackluster abilities and your lackluster work. And that's the only way that we can address equity, because if you're saying that the power majority can remain in power and they can remain comfortable, then nothing is changing. So this is Black History Month. Black history is 24/7, 365, but this is Black History Month. And I saw a white person's comment on an article where they said what white people have said to us for centuries, which is, we gave you opportunities. Black people did not do what you should do. Listen to that sentence, we gave you opportunities. So that says a lot when the power majority pretends that they own everything, despite the fact that Black people built this land on stolen land stolen from Indigenous people. We're stolen, raped, murdered, killed, controlled Black people and Indigenous people. Black people built buildings. We were the original capitalist scheme of profit. Abraham Lincoln only did Emancipation Proclamation because white people discovered other ways to profit that did not require enslavement of Black people. Instead, they found other ways to enslave us, but just not the form of slavery. So Emancipation Proclamation was not about our liberation and our freedom. It was about shifting the inequities to a different form that's more profitable. So whenever people say, we gave you this, first of all, it wasn't created by them. It does not belong to them.
Yeah.
So that's another form of, we have to understand what equity and justice means. The minoritized group should never ask for permission, because if you're asking for permission and it's like you're borrowing freedom, you're borrowing liberation, then that means it's not freedom and liberation, because the people can change their mind the next day. And this is people of every political party. They can change their mind the next day when it's no longer convenient for them, or when they don't feel like they're thanked and worshiped enough for what they did for minoritized groups.
So I'm going to ask this question then, because you hear this a lot. I mean, I've heard this too within the training that we've been doing. Is you said you don't believe in allies, but they say that, you know, like there's more white people have those positions of power. So I've heard people say, like, you need to have white people advocating for people of colors, you know, the issues that are happening there in order to actually have change happen. Do you agree with that? Yes or no, and why?
There need to be collaborators and contributors to change, but that does not require a title. Just like we talk about, right. So just like we talk about white slave abolitionists, the enslaved Africans did not have to turn around and say, thank you, white ally, because the collaboration and contribution does not require the contributors to have a title. So I always tell people, when I see ally trainings, I tell people that's a completely waste of time. That's like a bias training. There's so much work to do that's really straightforward. Like, if people go into communities and they go to these organizations, not the wealthy nonprofits that are the grant funders, but like the organizations that are in communities doing work, family organizations doing work, all you got to do is ask the people, how can I contribute to what you're doing? But instead, a lot of people say, well, I don't know anyone. Well, duh. As Black people, I don't know every white person, but I'm told as a Black person that I have to go into every white space and beg for education resources, beg for employment resources, beg for medical and health services. Black people in particular, we don't say, oh, we don't know all these white people, but white people love saying that to us, that I don't know the Black people in this group. And literally, you can go on the internet and do an internet search. You'll find all these Black organizations that are not famous. They're not wealthy. They're not well known, but they're actually the ones that are collaborating with other organizations and finding out what people really need, not based on what other people told us we need, but what we're telling you that we need. And therefore, instead of calling oneself an ally, don't call yourself anything. Just show up and do what you should do.
Be a decent human being, right?
Well, not just a decent human being, but also remember, you got to think about the power, right?
Yeah.
Yep. So like me as a cisgender heterosexual person, when I go into LGBTQIA spaces, particularly Black people, Indigenous people, Asians, non-white Hispanic, and the list goes on, who are LGBTQIA, you go into these spaces and you don't just come in and say, I'm a good person. You say, I'm a good person who is cisgender heterosexual, and I'm working daily to dismantle my power and the normality of cisgender heterosexuality, people pretending that it's just humans are born to be cisgender heterosexual, which is false, right? So you're going into these spaces, because a lot of times when it's white people who say like the be kind, like you'll see be kind stickers and buttons. Most of the people who say be kind, when you find out what they're doing in terms of tax paying patterns, voting patterns at their places of employment, they're doing some things that would not be considered kind, but they rationalize it by saying, well, I'm doing this to keep my job. So this is where the kindness has to interlock with addressing power disparities. And power disparities include people who don't feel like they're empowered. Like poor white people oftentimes say that I'm poor. Where's the power? Well, the power is in being white, because whiteness buffers a lot. Whiteness buffers disability. So which is 99% of disability services around the world are funded by white-based organizations. whiteness buffers LGBTQIA. There's a reason why most funded LGBTQIA parades and organizations are white people. And the list goes on and on. When talking about socioeconomic status, poor Indigenous people, poor Black people, we're told it's our fault. However, when people highlight the working class white people in the United States of America, then guess what? Politicians put that on their campaign. And they say it as America, though. They don't say white. They say Americans are struggling. Like the opioid epidemic, that existed literally for centuries. We can talk about the Japanese camps. We can talk about the Indigenous. Yeah, it's still the case. Indigenous have high rates of opioid addiction. Black people have high rates of opioid addiction. That's intentionally designed that way. But guess whose opioid addiction became the focus of the
once it hit the white crowd, I bet we heard about it. Yep.
Yeah, and you started seeing articles of young white men laying in the hospital bed with their families crying. That's ignoring the Indigenous and Black people in intentionally designed parts of cities that are segregated, where the opioid epidemic has always existed. So that's why we always tell people that we have to understand whose struggles are ignored because it's considered just our problem. And then whose struggles are considered the aggregate problem. That's something the nation should capture.
So to actually make change, it's going to mean we got to get uncomfortable, especially the white crowd, because like you said, people of color have been going into these uncomfortable spaces for years just because it's what they've had to do to get things done. Now white people are going to have to be the ones to make that uncomfortable move, right?
Yeah, but I always don't say white people have to be uncomfortable though, because what that results in is white people apologizing and crying. We don't need the apologetic whiteness. We don't need white people crying. I don't need white people to apologize to me about being white, because that's happened too over the years. White people have said, I am so sorry for being white. No, because as sociologists term colorblind racism also happens when white people, not only white people, but white people especially will say, well, if we get rid of racial categorizations, then everything will be okay. But that's not, first of all, I don't have to get rid of my Blackness that I'm proud of in order for us to pretend that racism will not exist anymore. Problems always exist, even if you give it a different name. And so we talk about sociologists over the decades who've written about categorical inequality. Those inequalities still exist, even if you call it something different. Like Black people, we've been given different racial titles. That's why I'm not a person of color. I'm not people of color. I'm not a woman of color, because Black people are the ones who were called colored. So I don't own that. I'm a Black person and I'm a Black woman, because we were the original people who were called colored. So when Dr. W.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and colleagues created NAACP, the National Association of Colored People, they created it based on that title, and they eventually included various people who are not white, but that doesn't mean that I am of color, because white people also have color. White people have melanin. You are not blank robotic slates. So that's important in getting white people to understand how race is white people as well. It's not dominated by white people, but it includes white people. Therefore, racism, the same way people talk about how racism has post-traumatic impact on us, it also has a post-traumatic impact on white people. It has a social psychological impact. It has a sociological impact and an impact that we have research that addresses how even poor white people have historically and currently voted for conservative politicians, because although the conservative approach messes with them financially, oftentimes poor white people have decided that they're going to at least benefit from whiteness, even if they don't benefit from economic resources. And that's something that researchers such as Dr. Anthony Giddens have written about, Du Bois, and other sociologists and scholars have written about that.
Oh, I feel like we could have a conversation forever, Doctor. We could, oh my God, this is so insightful. But I'm approaching up on our little half-hour time frame we try to keep for the show. So my last question I want to ask you about here is, you know, listeners here, the women that listen into our show, if they walk away from this with one thing, what do you want it to be, and what can they be doing?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So I always give people a thumbs up when they say, yeah, we've captured a lot, we've run out of time, because this is why this work is constant. It doesn't mean that you have to not sleep and all that stuff, but it's constant in terms of, that's why I call it 365 diversity. Diversity includes every aspect of inclusion and justice, and it's 365 because we can take a nap, we can go on vacation, we can spend time with our family while never pretending that the last thing we did was changing the whole world. Like, inequities are reversed the moment we take a nap. So that's one thing I want your listeners to understand. Don't get frustrated when things do not change immediately. Whether you're on a board of directors, you're teaching a class, you might be doing a fitness exercise with people in underserved communities. It might be something that you're like, oh my goodness, I put my passion, my money, my time into this. Why do people not seem grateful? Well, grateful is always relative, right? Because we're talking about inequities. This is stuff that has always existed, and it's going to exist long after we're gone. Inequities exist as long as humans exist. So it's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to be tired. But the problem is when people think there's going to be a quick fix. And the problem is when people think they're going to just be happy and feel fulfilled. And that happens a lot. Like the most recent examples are the George Floyd protests, when white people showed up and we were supposed to be like, wow, the world is changing, America's changing. No, that was the first beginning of COVID. People did not have to go to work and school. Yes, they had free time to come to a protest. Yes, some white people fought the police, but that is not commendable, because the police in USA in particular were created to control Black people after Emancipation Proclamation. So white people fighting the police means absolutely nothing, because white people are not changing the police in that regard. So I just want people to understand, go beyond what you see on social media, go beyond that hashtag, go beyond that nonsense you see on news shows. So I don't watch news for any news channel. They all are the same scheme. They literally make money. Every news station makes money on people in the USA in particular not reading. They know that most people are not reading. They're not learning beyond what they see on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Another problem is people pretend the problem is only Fox News and Republicans and GOP and Trump. It's literally all of them. Every politician, every political party, including the political parties like the Libertarians. So when people listen to this, I want them to not pretend this is based on their favorite politician. Because if you have a favorite politician, then you are part of the problem as well. None of these politicians should be your favorite. None of these political parties, because they all are banking on you not questioning them and not demanding changes from them. So this is where I also encourage you all who are listening to focus on family-based and community-based work. So I don't join elections and campaigns because I don't trust any of those people to make changes. Instead, I do community-based work, which includes medical and health services, change in schools, and other things that we can actually control. Some of it's going to come from our own pocket, yes, because the funds are intentionally designed to benefit the politicians and power majority. But this is where, if you say that you really want changes, you have to say, what can I realistically do in my spare time, in my busy schedule, and including if you have health conditions, what can you realistically do from a distance as well to make some changes? So that's what I encourage people to do.
I appreciate you sharing that so much. We've honestly taken some of that to heart here. So Soul Source is brought to you by Red Shoes, it's a PR company. We've actually done that within our company. Our boss has started these vaccine clinics, working with the communities of color and the organizations that are local. And we've actually gotten a ton of people vaccinated by going to places that they feel safe and they trust. And they're actually getting the vaccine because of that. So it's been incredible to have this conversation and validating to hear you say that we're on the right track. So thank you. Last question for you, Doctor, is if people want to get a hold of you, if they want to set up a training or they want to learn more, how do they find you?
Thank you. So 365diversity.com. They can find a lot of information, including my health equity resume and other resume and previous podcasts. And this podcast will eventually be on there as well. And speaking of COVID, so at the very beginning of COVID in March 2020, I did trainings for pharmaceutical companies that were helping to create the vaccines. And I explained to them that they need to specifically do a form of canvassing to actually reach communities that are most underserved by medical and health services. Unfortunately, these places did not do that. So they pretend to be shocked that COVID has disproportionately harmed Black people and Indigenous people. But we've told you about that for medical and scientific racism for 5 centuries, right? So when people say everyone has access to COVID vaccine, that's not true. Inequities don't stop happening just because you look at numbers and you believe the numbers. Vaccine is not reaching the same people. Just because you say you can go to Walgreens, CVS, whatever the case may be, it's not reaching people equally. So I just encourage people, never make jokes about people getting COVID. I've heard people unfortunately making jokes about people dying from COVID and saying, ha ha, that's what you get. Darwin says survival of the fittest. All of that is pathetic. And that's why I say pro-vaccine people and anti-vaccine people are the same problem, because it's all based in inequities and perpetuating inequities just to make a joke because you think it's cute on social media. So contact me if you want help in actually doing health equity work for your communities, which also includes knowing that some communities, including on the continent of Africa, have been sent expired COVID vaccines. And that's also happening in the United States of America. So never think America is above anything. There have been expired COVID vaccines in America as well. So this is something we have to understand in order to claim we're truly reaching people. So thank you.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Dr. Kimya. I will make sure to get the links to your website up in the show notes here so people can find you. I appreciate you taking the time. And we're going to have to do this again because we could go deeper for sure.
You know where to find me. Yes, you do.
All right. You take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. And if you want to hear more Soul Source, just subscribe to our show. We're available wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can watch us too. We're on YouTube. Just look for Soul Source. Soul Source is brought to you by Red Shoes Inc., a leading agency specializing in crisis and strategic communications, media relations, social media, and so much more. To learn more about Soul Source and Red Shoes, visit us at redshoesinc.com.